The 7 men were already in position when Wyatt Earp rode into Cannon Falls, Nevada, on a Wednesday morning in the spring of 1881, positioned at the specific points in the town's geography that a man who had been paid to think about these things would have selected, 1 at each end of the main street, 2 at the livery stable, 1 on the roof of the mercantile where the angle gave him a clean line to the road coming in from the south, and 2 more at the saloon that served as the operational center of the arrangement that had made their hiring necessary, and the man who had done the hiring, a rancher named Cord Beaumont who had been running cattle through the territory for 11 years and who had, over the course of those 11 years, developed a working arrangement with the county's legal infrastructure that allowed him to run it in ways that the legal infrastructure would not technically have endorsed had the endorsement been requested through official channels. Had paid each of them $50 in advance and $50 on completion of the task, and the task was simple enough that the price seemed generous until you understood who the task involved, at which point the price seemed like either an insult or an act of faith depending on your assessment of your own capabilities relative to the specific challenge being presented. Wyatt Earp had been riding toward Cannon Falls for 4 days when the 7 men took their positions, riding from the town of Elko where he had concluded a separate matter involving a dispute over mining claims that had escalated in the specific direction that disputes over mining claims escalated in when the parties involved had more guns than patience and less legal standing than they believed, and the conclusion of the Elko matter had taken longer than he had planned because the resolution required the kind of patience that the parties involved were not initially inclined to extend, and the extended timeline meant that by the time he was 4 days out of Elko and headed toward Cannon Falls the 7 men had been in position for 2 days already, which was 2 days more than any of them had anticipated needing to wait, and the waiting had done to them what waiting always does to men in positions of this kind, which was to introduce into their assessment of the situation the specific quality of doubt that is produced not by evidence against success but by the absence of the thing you are waiting for, by the continued non-arrival of the man you have been paid to stop, which raised in each of them, in varying degrees and configurations, the question of whether the man was coming at all, whether the intelligence that had prompted Beaumont to hire them was accurate, whether the whole arrangement was going to resolve itself without incident simply because Wyatt Earp had decided not to come, which would have been a satisfying resolution from a personal safety perspective but an unsatisfying one from a professional one, since the $50 completion bonus required completion of something and the non-arrival of the target was not completion of anything except the waiting. He came anyway. He came because Cord Beaumont's arrangement with the county's legal infrastructure had, over the course of 11 years, produced a specific set of conditions in Cannon Falls and the surrounding territory that made coming necessary in the way that certain things became necessary once Wyatt Earp had been made aware of them, not necessary in the sense of obligated by any specific authority or institutional mandate. He was operating in Cannon Falls without official sanction in the same way he had operated in other towns without official sanction when the official sanction was either unavailable or insufficient, but necessary in the sense that the situation was the kind of situation that his presence could address and that his non-arrival would leave unaddressed, and the leaving unaddressed of situations that his presence could address was not something Wyatt Earp did once he had been made aware of them, not out of arrogance or ambition but out of the specific operational understanding, refined across a decade of exactly these situations, that the situations did not address themselves in his absence and that the people inside them did not have the resources to address them independently. The specific situation in Cannon Falls was this. Cord Beaumont had been running cattle through a territory that included the grazing land of 11 smaller ranchers whose relationship to that land was legal and whose ability to defend that relationship against a man with Beaumont's resources and his working arrangement with the county legal infrastructure was approximately zero, and the 11 smaller ranchers had been, over the preceding 3 years, progressively losing the ability to use land they legally owned to graze cattle they legally owned, losing it not through any formal legal process that could be challenged in any formal legal proceeding but through the accumulation of practical obstacles that Beaumont's operation had placed in front of them, fences appearing overnight on land that the fences had no legal right to be on. Water rights diverted by engineering work that had been approved by a county official who had a business relationship with Beaumont, access roads blocked by cattle operations that had no legal right to block them, and the 11 smaller ranchers had each, individually, made the calculation that Harlan Burke's mining camp population had made and that Calder Voss's territory had made and that every population made when it assessed the cost of resistance against the resources available for resistance and found the assessment resolving in the direction of accommodation. And the accommodation had been proceeding steadily for 3 years when a letter reached Wyatt Earp in Elko describing the situation in enough detail to make the picture specific enough to act on. The letter had been written by a woman named Agnes Coulter, whose husband had operated the largest of the 11 smaller ranches until the combination of Beaumont's practical obstacles and 3 consecutive dry seasons had made the operation no longer viable, and who had stayed in the territory after her husband died of a fever the previous winter, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had a sister in Sacramento who had written twice asking her to come, but because she had something specific to do before she left, which was to make sure that someone who could do something about Cord Beaumont knew what Cord Beaumont had done and was doing, and the letter she had written to Wyatt Earp in Elko was the 3rd letter she had written and sent, the first 2 having gone to a U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City that had not responded and to a territorial governor's office that had responded with a letter explaining the appropriate legal channels for disputes of this kind, the channels being exactly the channels that Beaumont's arrangement with the county legal infrastructure had made functionally useless for anyone attempting to use them against Beaumont. And the 3rd letter had gone to Wyatt Earp because Agnes Coulter had heard his name in the specific way that people heard his name in territories like hers, as the name attached to the category of situation that official channels could not address, and she had written to it with the specific precision of a woman who had been refused twice and was not going to be refused a 3rd time, which meant she had written everything that needed to be written and nothing that didn't. And Wyatt had read the letter in Elko and had assessed its contents with the flat attention he gave to everything that might be operationally actionable and had found them actionable and had finished the Elko matter and had turned south toward Cannon Falls. He knew about the 7 men before he arrived. He knew because the same network of acquaintances and correspondence and territorial contacts that had delivered Agnes Coulter's letter to him in Elko had, in the days between the letter's arrival and his departure from Elko, delivered additional information about the preparations Cord Beaumont had made upon learning that Wyatt Earp had received the letter and was likely to respond to it, and the information about the 7 men was specific enough, names, positions, the price paid, to be operationally useful, and what the information produced in Wyatt's assessment was not additional caution. He did not operate through the addition of caution when new threats were identified, but a more complete picture of the situation, a picture that now included not just the underlying arrangement that had made the 7 men necessary but the 7 men themselves as a component of that arrangement, a component that needed to be addressed in the same methodical way that every other component needed to be addressed, which was not by avoiding it but by understanding it sufficiently to address it on terms that produced the outcome the situation required. The man on the roof of the mercantile saw him first. He saw Wyatt Earp coming down the south road at approximately 9 in the morning, riding at his characteristic pace, which was the pace that told you something about the man before he arrived, not the hurrying pace of someone who had been delayed and was making up time, not the cautious pace of someone approaching a situation they were uncertain about, but the specific unhurried forward motion of a man who knows where he is going and has decided to go there and for whom the going is itself the thing rather than the getting there, and the man on the mercantile roof watched this pace for approximately 2 minutes before he understood what he was watching, which was not a man who was unaware of the 7 positions that had been established to intercept him but a man who was aware of them and had decided that awareness was sufficient preparation, and this understanding, when it arrived in the man on the roof, produced in him the specific quality of recalibration that Wyatt Earp's arrivals consistently produced in the people positioned to observe them, which was the recalibration that occurred when a man's prior assessment of a situation was confronted with information that the prior assessment had not contained. He signaled to the man at the south end of the main street. The man at the south end of the main street watched Wyatt Earp approach and did the same calculation that Calhoun had done in the Oriental Saloon and that Reardon had done in Redemption Creek, and that every man in every configuration that had been assembled to stop or discourage or redirect Wyatt Earp had done when the moment arrived to actually stop or discourage or redirect him, which was to run the numbers on what stopping him actually required and to find, in the running of those numbers, that the numbers were not the relevant variable, that the relevant variable was something the numbers didn't capture, something that the man at the south end of the main street could see in the quality of Wyatt Earp's approach, in the pace and the posture and the specific character of the attention that was being directed at the town as he entered it. And the calculation resolved as it always resolved when this specific information was included in it, which was not in the direction the man at the south end of the main street had been paid to produce. He did not block the road. Wyatt Earp rode past him and into the main street of Cannon Falls, and the morning continued, and the man at the south end of the main street watched him pass and did nothing, and the man on the roof of the mercantile watched him pass below and did nothing, and the two men at the livery stable watched his horse approach, and one of them stepped forward to take it when Wyatt dismounted with the reflexive hospitality of men whose professional habits were stronger than their strategic instructions. And Wyatt thanked him and walked toward the saloon where the remaining two men were stationed and where Cord Beaumont had been waiting since 7 that morning with the specific quality of a man who had paid for certainty and was receiving uncertainty instead, and the certainty he had paid for was that Wyatt Earp would not reach the saloon, and the uncertainty he was receiving was that Wyatt Earp was walking toward the saloon's front door at 9:15 in the morning with the same pace he had used coming down the south road, unchanged by the 7 positions that had been established to change it. Beaumont came out to the porch. He came out because staying inside while Wyatt Earp walked toward his door would have communicated something he did not want to communicate, which was the acknowledgement that the door was a refuge rather than simply an entrance, and Beaumont was a man who understood the communication of positions, who had built 11 years of territorial control partly on the management of exactly this kind of communication, and coming out to the porch was the communication of a man who was in his own space, receiving a visitor rather than a man retreating to shelter, and he came out and stood on the porch and watched Wyatt Earp cross the street, and he did not look at the positions he had established because looking at them would have communicated something else he did not want to communicate, which was that he needed them. And he stood on the porch with his hands at his sides and his face composed into the expression of a man conducting ordinary business on an ordinary morning. Wyatt stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Beaumont. Beaumont looked at him. The morning was warm and the street was quiet in the way that streets were quiet when the people on them had understood that something was happening and had made the collective decision to be somewhere else for the duration of it. And the quiet of the street was the same quiet that the Oriental Saloon's card room had produced and that the saloon in Redemption Creek had produced and that every room and every street produced when Wyatt Earp was in it and something was being resolved, the quiet that preceded the resolution, and that was itself a form of the resolution, and in this quiet Wyatt spoke to Cord Beaumont for the first time, and what he said was not the threat and not the accusation and not the formal declaration of legal authority that Beaumont had been preparing his responses to, but a series of specific questions about specific things, the fences that had appeared on specific parcels of land, the water diversion that had been approved by the specific county official, the road blockages at specific locations and specific dates, and the questions were asked in a voice that was not elevated and not lowered and that carried in its evenness the specific quality of a man who has done the reading and is confirming the details. And Beaumont listened to the questions with the expression of a man who had not anticipated being asked questions and had prepared instead for the confrontation that questions were not, and the not having anticipated them was itself. Information was the specific kind of information that the people who observed Wyatt Earp's methods of address reliably received, which was the information that the situation was being handled in a way that fell outside the categories of response that the other party had prepared. The 7 men did not intervene. They did not intervene because the calculation that intervention required was a calculation that each of them was running independently and that each of them was finding resolved in the same direction, which was the direction that said the $50 completion bonus was not compensation for what intervention would cost, and this direction was produced not by cowardice. Most of them were capable men who had been in situations that required the qualities that those situations required, but by the specific assessment of what they were watching from their positions on the roof and at the ends of the street and at the livery stable and in the saloon, which was a man asking another man specific questions in a voice that contained everything the situation needed to contain, and the watching of it produced in each of them the understanding that the situation had already been addressed by the questions, that the questions themselves were the addressing of it, that what they were positioned to intercept had arrived and had not taken the form they had been paid to intercept and was now in the process of resolving itself through a mechanism that their positions had no relevance to. Beaumont answered the questions. He answered them not because he wanted to and not because he believed answering them would produce an outcome he preferred, but because the questions had been asked in a way that made the not answering of them more complicated than the answering, made the not answering communicate something he was not prepared to have communicated in front of the people who were watching, which was the acknowledgement that the questions had no acceptable answer, and the answering of questions that have no acceptable answer is its own form of answer, is the answer that says the questions are accurate and the situation they describe is real, and Beaumont's answers were careful and partial and shaped by the awareness that each answer was a brick in a structure that he was building against his own interests, and he built it anyway because the alternative was to refuse to answer, and the refusal would have been the same brick laid differently. What happened in the 3 weeks following the Wednesday morning conversation on Cord Beaumont's saloon porch was the specific mechanism of dissolution that Wyatt Earp's presence in a territory produced in arrangements of this kind, the mechanism that operated not through dramatic confrontation but through the accumulation of small practical changes, each one insufficient on its own but collectively sufficient to alter the balance of the arrangement past the point of its own sustainability. The fences that had appeared overnight on land they had no right to be on coming down in the same incremental way they had gone up, the water diversion under review by a county official who was not the same official who had approved it, the road blockages resolved through conversations that Wyatt did not attend but that his continued presence in the territory made possible in the specific way that his continued presence in every territory made things possible that were not possible without it, which was by changing the calculation that the people who needed to have those conversations made about the cost of having them, and the calculation changed because the presence changed it, because the knowledge that Wyatt Earp was in the territory and had asked specific questions and was going to continue to be in the territory until the situation was resolved changed the ratio of risk and benefit for everyone in the situation whose ratio had previously been resolving in Beaumont's favor. Agnes Coulter was still in Cannon Falls when the last of the fences came down. She had been in Cannon Falls for the entirety of the 3 weeks, staying in the room she rented above the dry goods store and watching the dissolution of the arrangement that had cost her husband 3 years of increasing difficulty and then his life, watching it with the specific quality of attention that a woman gives to the resolution of something she has spent a long time trying to produce and that is finally, incrementally, producing itself, and on the morning that the last fence came down she had done something she had not done in a long time, which was to ride out to the land that had been her husband's and stand at the edge of it in the morning light and look at it without the specific weight that the arrangement had placed on the looking, the weight of seeing land that was legally hers being practically inaccessible, and the looking without that weight was a different experience than the looking with it had been, was the experience of simply seeing the land, and she stood there for a while and then she rode back to town. Wyatt was getting ready to leave when she found him. He was at the livery stable, which was where he had spent more time in the preceding 3 weeks than anywhere else except the specific locations where his presence had been required for specific purposes, and he was saddling his horse with the unhurried efficiency of a man for whom the process of leaving a place was as routine as the process of arriving in it, and Agnes Coulter had come to the stable with something to say and had found, on arriving, that what she had come to say was harder to say than she had anticipated, not because the words were complicated but because the situation they were addressed to was more specific than she had expected, was the situation of a man saddling a horse who had done what he had come to do and was now doing what always followed the doing of it, which was leaving, and the specific quality of the leaving was something she had not prepared for, had not understood when she wrote the letter that the leaving was the same as everything else, was done with the same economy and the same absence of ceremony, and standing at the entrance to the stable watching it happen she had understood something about what she had asked for and received that she had not fully understood when she was asking for it, which was that it had a cost that was distributed differently than she had imagined, that some of the cost was borne by the man doing the leaving rather than by the people staying, and the specific quality of the leaving was part of that cost, was the visible expression of the part of it that could be seen from the outside. She told him that she was grateful. He told her that the fences were down and the water rights were under review and that the county official who had approved the diversion had been made aware that his approval was going to receive scrutiny from authorities above his level, and that Beaumont's operation would find the territory considerably less accommodating in the coming months than it had been in the preceding years, and that if the situation deteriorated in any specific way after he left she should write again to the same address in Elko because his mail was forwarded reliably. She asked him if he was always this way about it. He considered this for a moment and then said that he didn't know another way to be about it and that the not knowing was probably for the best, and then he finished saddling his horse and mounted it and rode out of Cannon Falls at the same pace he had ridden into it, and the 7 men who had been in position to stop him were long since dispersed. Had dispersed on the morning of his arrival when it became clear that the positions they had been assigned were not going to produce the purpose they had been assigned for, and Cord Beaumont watched from the window of the saloon as Wyatt Earp rode north out of town, and the watching was the watching of a man who had assembled 7 capable men and paid them $400 and positioned them at the specific points in the town's geography that a man who had been paid to think about these things would have selected, and Wyatt Earp had come anyway. And come not through the positions but through the same road he would have ridden in on. Regardless of whether the positions existed, and the coming anyway was the part that Beaumont would spend the subsequent months thinking about with the specific quality of attention that unresolved questions received, the question being not how Wyatt had come through the 7 men, because the answer to that was available and was not complicated, but why. Which was a question whose answer was also available and was also not complicated and was also the question that Beaumont found himself unable to stop asking, because the answer to it was the answer to everything else about what had happened in Cannon Falls in the spring of 1881, and the answer was simply that the situation had required it, and that Wyatt Earp came when situations required it, and that 7 men had not changed what the situation required, and that the 7 men were never going to change what the situation required, because what the situation required was not a number that could be exceeded by adding men to the other side of the equation but a quality that the equation itself was unable to measure, and the inability of the equation to measure it was precisely why the 7 men had been necessary, and precisely why the 7 men had not been sufficient, and precisely why Wyatt Earp had come anyway, and would come again, and would always come anyway, as long as there were situations that required it and as long as he was the one who came when they did. The 7 men in their various dispersions across the territory in the days and weeks following the Wednesday morning in Cannon Falls each arrived, at their own pace and through their own particular processing of what they had observed, at some version of the same understanding. An understanding that was not available to them in advance of the experience that produced it and that could not have been made available to them through any description or account, because the thing they had encountered was not a thing that descriptions or accounts could convey with the accuracy required for anticipation, was only available through direct experience, which was the experience of watching a man ride into a position that had been constructed specifically to stop him and continue riding without adjustment to the position, without acknowledgement of the position, without any of the behavioral modifications that the existence of the position should have produced in a man who was aware of it, and the watching of this experience produced in each of them the specific understanding that the position had been constructed on an assumption that was incorrect, the assumption being that a man's behavior in a given situation was primarily a function of the obstacles in that situation, that enough obstacles of sufficient quality would produce sufficient modification of the behavior, and what they had watched was evidence against this assumption, was evidence that the man they were positioned to stop was not primarily a function of the obstacles in front of him but of something else, something that the obstacles had no purchase on, and the understanding of this was the most durable thing they took away from the Wednesday morning in Cannon Falls, more durable than the memory of the specific events and more useful, in the subsequent situations of their lives that required similar assessments, than any other thing the experience provided. Cord Beaumont spent the following months in the specific process of unwinding an arrangement that had taken 11 years to build and that was now, in the changed conditions that Wyatt Earp's presence had produced and that continued to hold even after Wyatt Earp had left, no longer sustainable in the form it had taken, and the unwinding was not pleasant and was not fast and was not the kind of thing that produced a clean ending, was instead the kind of thing that produced a series of smaller endings, each one of which represented some specific portion of what the arrangement had consisted of, the fences coming down, the water rights being reassigned, the access roads being cleared, the county officials' approval being reversed, and Beaumont conducting each of these partial endings with the specific quality of a man who understood that the alternative to conducting them voluntarily was to have them conducted involuntarily by mechanisms that would be considerably more expensive than the voluntary version, and the understanding was accurate and the conducting was voluntary and the dissolution was complete within 6 months, and after 6 months the 11 smaller ranchers had recovered the practical use of the land they had never lost legal title to, and the 3 years of accommodation had ended, and the territory had returned to the configuration it had been in before Beaumont's arrangement had begun to alter it, which was not a perfect configuration and was not without its own complications and was simply the configuration that the territory had when the specific distortion that the arrangement had introduced was no longer present. Agnes Coulter wrote one more letter. She wrote it from Sacramento, where she had moved 3 months after the last fence came down, not because the situation had forced her out but because she had done what she had stayed to do and the sister who had written twice asking her to come was still waiting. And the letter she wrote from Sacramento was addressed to Wyatt Earp at the Elko forwarding address he had given her, and the letter said approximately this: that she had left Cannon Falls and the land was being worked again and the territory was as it should be and that she hoped he was well and that she wanted him to know that the third letter had been the right one to write, that she had not been wrong to write to him specifically, and that she was grateful in a way she had not found sufficient words for on the morning he left and still had not found sufficient words for but wanted to say anyway in whatever words were available, because the thing that had been done was worth saying thank you for even if the saying was insufficient to the thing. Wyatt received the letter at the Elko forwarding address, which had received it from a previous address in Dodge City that was no longer current, and he read it with the same flat reception he gave to all correspondence that reached him through that particular channel, which was the reception of a man accounting for information that is relevant to a situation that has already been resolved and finding that the information confirms the resolution without adding to it, and he put the letter with the other letters he kept, the ones that documented the situations he had addressed and their outcomes, a documentary record that served no purpose except as the specific kind of evidence that accumulates around a thing that has been done many times and that demonstrates, through its sheer quantity, that the thing works, that the method produces the result the method is designed to produce, that the 7 men in their positions and the Cord Beaumonts of the territory in their saloons with their windows looking north are not sufficient to prevent the thing from happening when the thing is necessary, and Wyatt had put the letter with the others and had not thought about it again, or not more than he thought about any of them, which was occasionally, in the specific way that evidence of completed work is occasionally reviewed by the man who completed it, not with satisfaction. Because satisfaction was not the register in which Wyatt processed his completed work, but with the flat acknowledgement that the thing had been done and had produced the result it was supposed to produce, which was enough, which was all that was required, which was the only standard that mattered. He was already somewhere else by then. There was always somewhere else, always the next letter arriving through the forwarding chain, always the next account of the next situation in the next territory, and the accounts arrived with the regularity of a kind of mail that the territory generated in response to its own needs, the mail of places that had exceeded the capacity of their existing resources to address what was happening in them and that were reaching, through whatever channels were available, toward the specific resource that Wyatt Earp represented, and the reaching always found him because the reaching was the kind of reaching that Wyatt Earp responded to, and the response was always the same response, which was to finish what he was currently doing and turn in the direction the reaching was coming from and ride at the pace that was his pace, not hurrying and not hesitating, toward whatever was waiting at the other end of the distance, because the situation required it, and because the situation requiring it was the only reason he needed, and because 7 men or 1 man or no men at all standing between him and the situation had never changed what the situation required and had never stopped him from coming anyway, and had never been going to. There is a particular calculation that men make when they are positioned to stop another man from doing something, a calculation that runs the available variables. Numbers, positions, capabilities, the specific configuration of advantages that the positioning has produced, and arrives at a conclusion about whether the stopping is achievable, and the calculation is usually reliable, usually produces an accurate assessment of whether the stopping is achievable, because the calculation is usually running on variables that are relevant to the stopping. Variables that describe the physical and tactical reality of the situation in sufficient detail to generate a valid prediction about its likely outcome, and the calculation had been running on exactly these variables. When Cord Beaumont assembled the 7 men and positioned them at the specific points in Cannon Falls that a man who had been paid to think about these things would have selected, and the calculation, run on those variables, had produced a result that suggested the stopping was achievable, that 7 capable men in 7 strategic positions represented a sufficient obstacle to prevent 1 man from reaching the saloon at the end of Cannon Falls's Main Street, and the calculation was not wrong. About the variables it included, was accurately assessing the tactical significance of 7 positions and the capabilities of the men filling them, but was wrong about a variable it did not include, which was the variable that determined what Wyatt Earp was going to do when he saw the positions. And the variable that determined this was not in the calculation because it was not a variable that the calculation was designed to capture, was not a number or a position or a capability but a quality, the specific quality of a man for whom the existence of obstacles was not a sufficient reason to change direction, who processed the information about the obstacles as information about the situation rather than information about what he was going to do, because what he was going to do was already determined before the information about the obstacles was received, was determined by the situation that had produced the letter from Agnes Coulter, and 7 men were part of the situation. But were not the situation, were a component of what needed to be addressed but were not the thing that determined whether addressing was necessary, and the thing that determined whether addressing was necessary was the situation itself, and the situation had determined it, and Wyatt Earp had come anyway, because the situation required it, because he came when situations required it, and because 7 men could be positioned but could not change what situations required, and the situations would always require it, and he would always come, and the 7 men would always step aside, not because they were afraid, though some of them were, but because the calculation, when it was run with all the relevant variables included rather than only the ones the calculation was designed to capture, always resolved in the same direction, which was the direction that said the man coming down the road was going to arrive at the saloon at the end of the main street, and that the most rational response to this information was to let him